Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's P&G Alumni Network Enrichment Series webinars. This is your host, Ileana Rojas, and I'm happy to be back as your MC for today. And I'm here together with Vince Spiziri and Clare Golla, who will be sharing with us their expertise on how to join a nonprofit board, which would have been so helpful to me a couple of years ago, I have to say, but I'm sure it will still be. Okay, so now, without further ado, let me introduce you to Vince and Clare so that they can take it from here and take us through all their expertise on how to join a nonprofit board. Vince, Clare, thank you for joining us this morning.
All right, good morning, good afternoon, and thank you, Ileana, for hosting this and having Clare and I speak this morning. As the poll indicated, we have a diverse audience by functional expertise, by geography, by P&G experience. We have a lot of perspective across our audience today, which is really actually very exciting. But I always like to remember that we have one thing in common, this entire audience, a shared P&G history, set of values, set of experiences, and just basic guiding principles. And I think that really is the essence of this philanthropic effort that all of us are interested in, or we wouldn't be dialing in today. So we share that in this audience, as diverse as it is, a common foundation with our P&G experience and a common passion for attempting to impact either our corner of the world or the world at large through some sort of philanthropic engagement. So it's a pretty exciting group for Clare and I, certainly, to be able to engage with today, and we're thrilled that you have us. Next slide, please, Ileana. Our theme today is I'm thinking of joining a nonprofit board. Now what? It's kind of a good question, and it gets to the root of basic philanthropy, right? As I think it's just actually pretty timely, just given the moment that we're in, right? The complexities that we're dealing with as a planet around a whole host of issues that we certainly don't have time today to engage on, but they're real and they're affecting every one of us. As if you'll allow me to maybe channel John Lennon, who might have at one point said, "Imagine a world without philanthropy." That's kind of a terrifying world to think about, right? That's a world with probably no museums and no symphonies and operas, and the arts as we know them as a pretty different thing than we experience today. Certainly our education system at all levels, maybe most timely of all, our healthcare system and medical research, and the most essential social safety net are around the world largely supported, not exclusively, but largely supported by philanthropy, as defined by not just financial resources, but people devoting their talents and committing their time. That's the essence of the P&G Alumni Foundation, which is actually the philanthropic arm of this P&G network that we are all members of. There is since its inception, core tenet of the network that we would support, just like we learned at P&G, a giving back culture, and commit ourselves as one of the three tenets of the network from its founding to be engaged around philanthropy. And the foundation is an outgrowth of that. And working together as a group of alums over the last 15 years or so, next slide, actually go 2 slides. We've awarded over $1.3 million in grants. We've touched over 60,000 lives across 5 continents in 25 countries. And every one of those initiatives, next slide, has been led by one of our fellow alums. That's really our guiding principle, is that we gather resources, assets, right, from our alumni group, from around the world. We have a great commitment to stewardship, to making sure that we are focusing our efforts on a single philanthropic mission, and that's creating economic empowerment, or facilitating and promoting economic empowerment around the world. We've been doing that at great success. What is economic empowerment? What are these initiatives about? Think of them as creating employment or employment opportunities through job skill training and vocational training, through best practices, sharing of best practices around business training, and supporting entrepreneurial ventures literally across 5 continents. We're just one of what is a total mosaic of philanthropy around the world. And we kind of view our alums as called to serve. And not just, as I said, our financial support, but our talents as business professionals and feeling the need to pay it forward, if you will, in recognition that all we benefited from our own P&G training and other experiences. Most recently, just as maybe a most timely example, the foundation has partnered with the larger Network Women's Forum to help promote and create engagement around this month's celebration of International Women's Day, another economic empowerment initiative that is very much in sync with what we do. Every single grant that we give is sponsored by, stewarded by, and the results are accountable to a single P&G alum who is in a participatory way managing through that. So we're sharing our values, if we will, we're sharing our talents, and we're sharing our resources, right, to try and make a change everywhere we can around the world to create the empowerment that each one of us feels that we've been given, the opportunity we've been given from not just our P&G experience, but certainly profoundly by our P&G experience. Next slide. So that brings me to today's topic, right? I've been asked to join a not-for-profit board. Now what? What does that mean, right? One of the things that happens to us as successful professionals with the credentials and experience of our P&G experience and others and our passion for some kind of philanthropic participation is we get solicited. So our featured speaker today, Clare Golla, is Managing Director at Bernstein Private Wealth. And Clare is based in Chicago, and she leads the endowment and foundation practice of a $100 billion private wealth practice. And in addition to her leadership of the practice, she directly works with wealthy donors and families and not-for-profits on various giving and stewardship strategies. And that's her professional experience. But in addition to that, Clare as an individual has lots of experience serving on a number of boards of various missions across her own career. So it's thrilling for me to have Clare, a colleague of mine as well, to speak to this topic. Welcome, Clare. Maybe as a way to begin, as I turn the conversation over to you, why don't you start with why should anyone in this webcast even consider joining a board in the first place?
Yeah, thanks, Vince. Look, it's a privilege to be here. I really appreciated hearing a little bit more background on your philanthropic efforts as well. So as you mentioned, yeah, look, this is a personal passion for me. My entire career, I've been in and around the not-for-profit sector in the philanthropic universe. So I get to answer some of these questions today, I think both from some of my personal experience as well as my professional experience here at Bernstein, overseeing a business where we work with hundreds and hundreds of boards of directors across the country, both of private foundations that are out there, supporting causes they care about and distributing assets to the community, but also organizations that are out there raising money to support their respective missions and everything in between. So I get asked, and my colleagues get asked often about, I'm interested in joining a board. I don't really know how to go about sort of researching it or finding the right organization. But the first question I ask is, why are you interested? And there tend to be these 3 sort of buckets when people respond to this. So the first is personal experience, right? Wanting to make a difference, right, and do something associated with a cause that might be meaningful to you personally. So a lot of us at some point in our careers or in our lives look back and we think, wow, I'm really fortunate to be where I am today. What are some of the institutions? What are some of the elements as I look back on my life that really helped me get to where I am? Or what are some of the issues or causes or, the things in my life that really affected me. And so I think of this personal bucket as things like alumni, right? So this would ring a bell, with folks that are on this call, whether it's a work alumni or educational. It might be something medical related, a disease that affected a family member or yourself, right? A lot of folks get involved and really dip their toe in, I think, to philanthropy for the first time because of some personal experience like that. Or then really supporting, whether it's, something about your own identity, right? It could be your ethnicity, your religion, gender, any of those sorts of things, ways that you identify, and wanting to really make a difference and support, your identity and change the world for the better there. And so that's the first bucket. The second is really purely professional, right? Some folks think, whether it's I'd want to have something to really build up my resume, it would be important for me to have this other element. The other is, networking opportunities and skills building, right? So being a part of a board of directors of an institution does provide you with that opportunity to lend your professional skills to a different type of institution supporting the community in some way. So I think the professional piece is can't be understated or can't be overstated, I should say. And then finally, the community piece, right? Supporting community institutions. So whether that you're, defining community as local or national or global, really, folks wanting to help support the creation of a thriving community, positive change in the community. I know for me personally, I'll just give a few examples. So, on the personal side, I've been involved with the Chicago Foundation for Women for many years as a donor and on the investment committee. And the community side, interestingly, I joined the board of my own local community foundation outside of Chicago where I live some years back, ended up chairing that community foundation board. And ultimately, I did not join that board for professional reasons, but because I got to know so many people there in a, I'd say sort of a quasi-professional setting, and people could really see that I was a competent professional. I was one of those people who got things done when I said I would, those sorts of things. It ended up being a really great sort of business networking opportunity as well. And then finally, the community piece. I'd say the community foundation is sort of, a piece of that. But also I am on the board currently of a youth center in a lower income community in Chicago, and that's an important thing for me. So there are, different reasons that folks join different boards, and I think that's sort of been reflected in my own personal life. What about you, Vince?
I've got a similar set of, I won't go through all of my own board experiences, but I think the motivations that you talked about touch me as well. I'll add one. Sometimes you just get asked, right?
Right.
Sometimes people, through whatever social or professional interaction, they're looking for talent, they're looking for skills, they're looking for successful people to attract to their board, and you might not even have engaged deeply in that organization, and you get solicited. Talk to that, because I think that probably is something that happens to lots of former P&G executives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, so interestingly, the getting asked piece is, I'm glad you mentioned it. It can be one of the trickiest ones to navigate because in many cases, and I can actually go back to a similar experience I had years ago where I learned by, I'd say, sort of trial by error. I was asked to be on a somewhat visible board. I was flattered, frankly, to be asked. And I ended up joining that board without really doing any real due diligence. I just thought, oh, wow, they want me? That's fantastic. And it ended up not being a very positive experience for a number of reasons. And ultimately, I was able to, after some time serving, actually extricate myself from the situation. But it was an example of me getting asked and just jumping at it because it was the first opportunity. So now I would say the flip side is some folks can get asked and it ends up being a wonderful experience. But in that case, I would provide the advice that you still want to do some due diligence, right? Really sit down and get to know that organization before and find out what the commitments are and the responsibilities and the accountability before you sign on.
So what does that due diligence look like, right? Because every organization is that's worth anything is probably pretty good at telling their story and creating some, trying to do something significant to that mission. How do you do it?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So actually, if you want to go to the next slide, that was a good segue there. I think there are a few, different ways, and everyone will have their own path, and every situation is different. But as just a very high level guide, one thing that I tend to recommend to folks when they ask me or when they've been asked, the first thing I ask is, well, how well do you know the organization? Have you been involved on any of their committees or gone to any of their events, or do you know anyone on the board already? So one thing, especially if you're not familiar with the organization, is potentially, like, there really is no better way to get to know an institution than getting involved, right? So potentially doing some sort of volunteer work, just attending their gala or, one of their events. Oftentimes there are, I'd say, sort of subcommittees that aren't necessarily at the board level. So there may be a women's board or a young professionals board, or, different types of things that you could get, or just a committee for a specific event or initiative. So there may be different ways to get involved beforehand. The other is just getting to know other members. So if an organization is serious about its recruitment efforts for the board, they should have at least a couple of people interviewing you, right? So it might be the board chair, the CEO or the executive director, maybe another member from the board who happens to be on one of the committees that board is really interested in attracting you to. So let's say you have some sales experience, they might be interested in bringing you on to their fundraising committee, or if you have finance experience, they may be interested in having you join, their finance committee. There are a whole bunch of different. They know you're really social, and maybe there's an events committee or something like that. So they're definitely, I would say, try to get to know a few people, and just try to get to know the culture of the organization. And then something that I would say is very important, and we'll go through some very specific questions later, but you want to ask and try to get a sense of what type of board this is. And when I mention that, what type of board, all boards of directors of not-for-profits and foundations and associations really aren't created equal. I would say it's more of a spectrum. And so, Vince, you might be able to share a little bit, but I know I've been on boards across the spectrum, from much more sort of a grassroots working board, all the way to more of a governance board. And actually, if you go to the next page, we could touch base on that. But Vince, I'm curious about if you have any other thoughts on getting started in some of that due diligence.
Well, I'll echo all your comments, but I think this is a very important slide and an important part of anybody's due diligence, because I have participated on boards across the entire spectrum, and had good and positive experiences across the spectrum. So it's not as if one is better than the other. At least that's my view. It's not a matter of preference, but there are boards that are largely, as you said, governance in nature. They tend to be the larger institutions that have substantial staffs, and the board is largely filled with significant donors, right? That's, you sort of have to contribute at a pretty high level to even be a member of a board for something like that. Think of the big museum in your town, or your alma mater board. Those are sort of examples of those, all the way down to, if you'll allow me, the P&G Alumni Foundation board. The board is basically the staff, right? It is very hands-on. It's a group of alums working together and directly sort of managing the process. And you could speak better than I, Claire, to the range in between that. But I think it's maybe the most important part of the due diligence is understanding what you're potentially engaging in and what those expectations are.
Yeah. Yeah, I think absolutely, and that's you just nailed it. I think with the size of the staff, right? Because when I start with this sort of one end of the spectrum with a working board, this tends to be a number of sort of smaller community-based organizations, or in your case, Vince, that you just mentioned, sort of a volunteer effort, right? That is part of a larger institution, but it really isn't fully staffed. For smaller community-based organizations, and I've been on staff and on the board of different types of organizations like this, there can be few experiences in the world that provide you with more satisfaction and more of a feeling like, wow, I'm really making a positive difference in this community. This organization really needs me. So it can be, as you can see here, on these sort of bullet points here, it can be a very high impact kind of role. The piece of it, though, the flip side is it can also be an incredibly time-consuming role, and there's a lot of responsibility there. There is oftentimes a lot on the shoulders of the board of directors because the staff just really doesn't have the internal capacity to handle a number of things. And when I say this, I mean, and I have here we have here all hands on deck, right? If there is a fundraising event, it's not like they have a whole significant development staff like a university or a major institution that would be staffing that event. It's a lot of board members out there getting silent auction items, sort of trying to get deals from caterers and that sort of stuff, right? The time and expertise, the professional skills needed. So if you have human resources skills, you may end up helping draft the, human resources, the employee manual for the organization. Really, there's a lot, that could entail. Again, really high satisfaction. You get to know the organization really, really well. But you also have to gauge, how much time do I have? What's my travel schedule like? What are my family commitments right now? Because it really can be, pretty significant. When I was on the board of the community foundation, that's while the asset size is really large that we managed, the staff was really small. And so as, chair of the finance committee, we ended up, rewriting the investment policy statement. We ended up writing, a whole bunch of different policies. It was just a lot of, really deeply involved in the grant making process. It was just a very, very time consuming board experience. Whereas I'm on the board of a private foundation now, which is fully staffed. And what's kind of nice is I can just show up at the meetings, and there's obviously some work I do in between in terms of reading, and I'm on the investment committee and things like that. But it's much less of a heavy lift in terms of the responsibility that I'm feeling that, just to keep the lights on at the organization. So I guess that's a good way to, kind of move down to these, the governance boards. So you've got this sort of small grassroots organizations. I'd say as organizations sort of become more professionalized, the staff is larger, they have a development team in particular, they really have a strong sort of C-suite, you start to delve into more of a governance board. So you're moving from the all hands on deck being, sort of really rolling up your sleeves and involved in some of the day-to-day to the oversight, which is really, I think, what's intended. Boards are really, directors of not-for-profit organizations and foundations really are charged with the oversight of the organization technically. And so for larger institutions, this can be much more structured. The time commitments are much more predictable. You tend to know when your meetings are going to be, what your assignments are going to be. The committees are often staffed, so there is someone organizing it for you rather than you sending out the Outlook invites and all that sort of stuff. These are also oftentimes larger and highly visible memberships. So think about sort of the key institutions in the community. Vince mentioned earlier universities, health centers, cultural institutions in every community. The one thing that I would mention, especially if it is one of your first dipping of your toe into being a board member, these often come with a higher financial expectation as well than on many working boards. Now, typically, it's best practice for boards of directors to have some sort of give or get, quote unquote, policy, meaning you will commit to either raising a certain amount of money or making a contribution of a certain amount of money to that institution as a board member. It's sort of skin in the game, right? Making sure that you're on board. And when organizations are, reaching out, trying to raise money, and they are, applying for grants and things like that, they will be asked the question, what percentage of your board is actually, contributing financially to the organization? And organizations obviously want to be able to say 100%, right? So that is certainly, I'd say, a best practice that there is an expectation that you give something. Larger institutions, as I mentioned, could be a pretty significant check that you are expected to cut. So one thing is to, check in with your place of business, to check in, do you have a match? Do you have, those sorts of things? How will you fulfill this financial expectation? And can you really afford it? Is this something? And I'd say equally important is, do you, and I think this is actually going back to number one question that you want to answer is this mission something that I really can get behind? Is this something that really is important to me? And do I want to cut that check, right, for this organization? Do I want to support it in that way? Do I want to be an ambassador for this organization and in this institution and actually introduce others to it? Because you got to have that, before anything else. So, if you're feeling like, this larger institution is really something I want to get involved in, I'm not sure if I want to go all in yet. Many institutions do have other subcommittees or sub boards. So there might be a women's board, a young professionals board, sort of a junior board, different committees for different types of events. So you could always dip your toe in by joining something like that first. Vince, I don't know if you have anything to add to that piece.
No, why don't we talk about the what I think is next on the agenda in terms of what are the considerations, right? It's beyond just this. There are things to watch out for, things to sort of pay attention to, and
yeah, definitely. I think the next slide, you're moving right through here. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are a lot of considerations, and this can be a great, on this slide here, a great sort of template for the conversations that you're having with board members as you're doing your due diligence, because the responses to these questions will be quite telling in terms of, number one, I think how serious is the organization about its recruitment of board members? How organized are they also? And if they're very organized, you can sort of feel like, okay, maybe it'll be a little bit less of a heavy lift in terms of a lot of the organization falling on my shoulders, right? Or it may be, wow, they really need my help in getting getting some of these things organized. So number one, absolutely, does the organization's mission interest me? So I mentioned earlier, right, this association that I was flattered to be asked to be a part of this institution some years back, and it ended up that the mission just really wasn't interesting to me. And while it was flattering to be asked, there were a lot of issues going on at the organization, which I'll get to in a sec, that coupled with my not really, all other things being equal, I would rather be an ambassador to a different type of organization. It just wasn't the right fit. I learned from that experience, and later on, a friend of mine was really, bugging me to join the board of Chicago has a planetarium, and look, the planetarium is amazing. It's a great institution, but there was a pretty significant financial contribution associated. And she kept saying, "Oh, it's great networking. It's very visible. Blah blah blah," but that's not really my thing, and it's probably the thing for a lot of other people. But I had to just politely decline because I was more interested in other issues, and I wanted them to be able to find someone where, STEM and science and, the planets or the universe is of more interest, right? And for me, it's more about community development and other types of issues. So I think I learned from that experience. We mentioned time commitment, right? That's critical. Another thing that is so critical, and I have been on boards where there haven't been term limits, Or I've also been on, and that's a lesson learned. Term limits mean when you're signing on for a board position, it is a 2-year commitment. It is a 3-year commitment. It is a time limited commitment where you have the choice to re-up, or they rotate out and you could rejoin later. If there are no term limits, it can become a little awkward when you want to, sort of disengage, at some point. So it's about expectation setting. So that's sort of a best practice. What are the term limits and are they staggered? And what I mean by that is what you don't want to have happen is you join a board of directors and yes, they have term limits, but they happen to have a big gap. Some people have left the board, and it's a board of 12 people, and they have to bring on 6 new people, and all of a sudden, 6 old, members leave, and you're stuck with a ton of responsibility that you really didn't sign on for. So you want to be at an organization where they actually have a grid, they have a schedule, and they are staggering when they are bringing on and when they are rolling off different members. So that's a good question to ask. And if they don't, it's something that you could offer to help build in for some of the sort of smaller organizations. The responsibilities.
It's also, hey Claire,
oh, go ahead. Yeah.
It's also on that topic. It's also a good way to understand the reason for why the vacancy that you are potentially filling has been created, right? Because to your point, if it's a natural structural rotation of board membership that creates new opportunities on an annual cycle, that's pretty self-evident. But sometimes there's a board exodus that creates opportunities that might not be, right? It's not going to be part of the brochure that gets presented to you, and you have to sort of understand what is the nature of the opening that has been created, and do I understand why it exists?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great point. Have they specifically sought me out for certain reasons, or are they just again, like an all hands on deck? We just we need to fill a bunch of vacancies too. So that's important. We talked about the size of the board and the composition. I think the last 4 pieces here are interesting, and that is the sort of these liability issues. So how does the board handle conflicts of interest? So basically, is there a conflict of interest policy? What's my liability as a board member? One thing you should always ask, larger institutions will typically always have this, but do you have directors and officers or D&O liability insurance? Is there any current litigation going on at the organization? That was actually something that I found out was going on at that one association that had invited me, and I was so honored to join the board, and then thought, yikes, what have I gotten myself into? So these are some things that you want to ask. Is the organization financially stable? Are the revenues diversified? And this is, I think, particularly with some of the smaller and mid-sized organizations, there may not be a substantial financial challenge today, but what are the risks around the corner, right? And then finally, how does the organization decide what gifts they'll accept? Does it ensure that, donor intent is honored? These get a little bit more technical. I think they all speak to, though, the idea that when you're joining a board of directors, you are signing on as an individual with legal responsibilities for oversight of the organization. And so it is a very high level type of role, but board members are responsible for the policies and procedures, hiring of the CEO, the chief executive, making sure that the programs and services are at least, monitored at a high level, ensuring adequate financial resources. A lot of these things are part and parcel of being a board member. And if there is litigation, oftentimes the first folks that would be sought out would be board members as directors of the organization. So it's just something to consider. It's typically not an issue, but it's certainly, you want to make sure you have your bases covered there.
Hey, Claire, what is a conflict of interest?
Great question. So a conflict of interest, when you join a board of directors and you are really, I would say, stewarding assets, sort of shepherding resources on behalf of the community, your purpose is to put the organization first, put the purpose and the mission of the organization, first and foremost. You are not joining that organization for personal gain or gain for anyone sort of in your, very immediate circle. So your personal family, that sort of thing. And one of the responsibilities of a board member is to ensure the legal and ethical integrity of the organization. So I'll give an example. In my world, I am asked, obviously heading up a business of endowments and foundations for a major investment firm, I'm asked to be on a lot of investment committees. And so one of the things that we always have to be mindful on investment committees is that if I'm on that investment committee, I am not going to have Bernstein, bid for the business, the investment business, right? Because that would benefit me. That would benefit me in my business if we were to manage the assets, right? And certainly if you're on a board of directors, if you joined a board of directors and your firm happens to be banking or managing the assets or have some sort of a vendor relationship, what you'd want to do is sign a conflict of interest policy saying, you know what, I'm going to recuse myself from any decisions that have to do with this piece of business that could benefit me directly, right? So that's where you kind of get, it's a little bit of gray territory, but it's really anything that, your firm, you're an attorney and the organization needs some legal advice. You can't charge that organization to provide your legal advice. If you find someone who can do it pro bono, great, right? But you can't be personally benefiting financially. Those are just a couple I think of.
Yeah,
Vince,
I think those are good ones. You sort of are prompting a memory I have is one of my earlier experiences in serving was not in any way a conflict, but my motive was, in all honesty, was an attempt to network with the people that I saw on that board. Right.
Yep.
That would be a good thing for me professionally to know this blue ribbon group of people. Wouldn't that be a great thing? And, as I did the due diligence as you're describing, it was pretty obvious to me that wasn't the right incentive. That wasn't the right motivation for me to engage with that organization, even though, I would not be crossing the lines that you've sort of talked about. It speaks to what's the point for me? Why am I interested? And if my interest is in any way driven by access, that's speaking to me, and I should listen to that voice in my due diligence, right? It's a soft thing, but it's a very important thing.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because I mentioned the my involvement in the community foundation where I live, and when I joined it, I was in a different role. I wasn't joining for for business reasons at all, and interestingly, I was just really committed. I work downtown, I travel, and I felt like I want to do something where I'm really supporting and kind of learning more about the actual local community that I live in. And I want to be giving back in some way. And I had a real passion for that. And I do have a passion for sort of place-based philanthropy, community-based philanthropy, and people in the in the community, giving voice to the challenges and the solutions. So I firmly believe, and I mentioned, ultimately a number of business relationships developed for me both directly and indirectly from that board experience, but I wasn't seeking them out. What happened was I was really passionate about some of the committees I was on, the initiatives I was on. I was, later at night sending emails, like getting, really people could, the excitement was palpable, right? And I got to be very close with folks in these working relationships. And I think right away, that trust barrier sort of, drops because you're working towards a common goal, a common mission, and that just facilitates other opportunities. If there were, some, you need investment advice, you should go talk to Claire. It was, kind of one of those things that ended up happening, but it was absolutely because I wasn't in it for that. And I always say I've had a number of different folks that I do business with, say to me, Claire, I don't get it. Like I joined this board of directors and I was on the board for a year and I didn't even get any business out of it. And I'll say, well, you didn't get any business out of it because that's why you joined the board of directors, right? People could smell that a mile away. Like, the one thing you don't want to be is that guy, right? That like when you walk in the room, people are thinking, oh gosh, like he's going to tell me about his insurance business or tell me about his investment business or tell me, like it's just, I think the networking is a great element of it, but it really, it shouldn't be, your experience is not going to be anywhere near as, valuable and impactful in your own life if that's the goal.
Yeah. Why don't we proceed? Because I want to make sure we provide some time for questions. I know we have a few.
So look, I mean, I think that if you move ahead, I mean, actually, if you could even move to the next page. Yeah, this is also, in addition to the questions that we provided that are a great guide for some of those due diligence conversations you're having. This is, I pulled this from BoardSource, and BoardSource is a fantastic resource for current board members of organizations, but also people who are interested in potentially joining a board, just to get, educate yourself a bit. So I'd strongly recommend just, it's boardsource.org. They've got a lot of different resources online, free resources. But these are some great, just a list of responsibilities. I was mentioning a couple of them earlier. Just to get a sense of what am I really on the hook for, right, as a director of an organization. And this is it, right? They can be interpreted different ways, but these are certainly, the key elements. And then I just, as a follow-up, if you go to the next slide. Again, I mean, walking into this, understanding what the responsibilities are at a high level, understanding and feeling good about the why in terms of why you're joining the board and asking, a lot of questions. I'd say equally important is once you are on a board of directors is you're really sort of the CEO of your own path, right, in terms of philanthropy. And so you want to get engaged and stay engaged. And on many boards of directors, the real work and the real value add happens at the committee level. So many boards require, right, that all members join one or two committees or something like that. But definitely, join some of those committees, get involved in some of the initiatives, do something beyond just the quarterly board meetings. And that's really where I would say it's kind of cheesy, but the magic happens, right? That's really where you get more of a flavor for the mission and you feel like you're really making an impact. And so with that, I'll just, turn it back to you, Vince. We have some great, BoardSource. See, I mentioned it, and there it is. GuideStar.org is another good one. And we have some other sorts of resources here to help educate you.
Perfect. Well, I think I can speak for Claire and myself that while this is a topic that we could spend a lot of even deeper dives on some of these areas, here are some resources. And I want to make sure that any of this sort of due diligence message that is baked into today's presentation doesn't in any way dilute your appreciation for how powerful an experience it can be for you to participate directly in the leadership of a not-for-profit organization. And I know I speak for Claire here that and myself, obviously, that some of the most rewarding experience I've ever had professionally have been the work that I have been involved with. Some of the most enduring relationships, personally and professionally, that I have been able to develop are a result of working together to do some, important work in a community or in a larger space. As Claire called it, the magic. There is magic in this, and it's certainly our intent here to be inspiring, not to be cautious. But caution is required, right? A process is required, thoughtfulness is required, a certain amount of deliberateness is required in you making the right choices and navigating through a process. But the end of navigating that successfully could likely be some of the most rewarding work you ever do. And we certainly look forward to helping Claire. As you can see here, there are resources. Claire is available. I'm certainly available. The Alumni Foundation, whether you choose to be directly involved in it or not, I certainly would ask that you seek to learn more, and I'm happy to provide some of that missing information if you want to reach out to me directly. But we'd love to have you either share some of the knowledge base with our foundation where we can be helpful to you in your process, or if what we're doing as a group of alumni is interesting to you, I certainly would ask you to give that some consideration and try to learn more. And with that, I will turn the session back to Ileana. I think has some questions from the group.
Yes, and thank you so much for sharing. I just put both your information on if anybody's interested on reaching, because I think, like you said, Vince, we can keep going on this fabulous and fascinating topic that most of us, would like to get involved in, and I know that this was really helpful for me. We only have time for a couple of minutes, but for a couple of questions, but I'll go forward with some of them. So in getting involved as a board member of a nonprofit, what financial contributions or expectations have you experienced?
Well, that's a good one. I'm gonna let Claire handle that one.
Well, and you can jump in too, Vince, because we both have personal experiences, and then I see everything across, under the sun in the wide range of organizations that we work with here at Bernstein. Look, as I mentioned earlier, typically, or in many cases, the policy is considered a quote unquote give or get policy, right? So what it means is they may set it at, for smaller organizations, the give or get is often lower. It might be $1,000, $2,500, something like that, where they'll say, okay, through a combination of, selling tickets to our event, making a personal contribution, your corporate match that you might have, all of that, we expect that you as a board member will deliver this amount of revenue into the organization. And in many cases, it is also sort of that friend raiser type of, element as well. They love for you to be able to be an ambassador and bring new faces and new supporters to the organization. As the institutions tend to get a little bit larger or more established, that financial contribution can go up to I'm on a board, or actually just stepped off of a board where it was $10,000, but there are $25,000. They're higher than that. It can get pretty significant, and oftentimes with the larger financial contributions, you'll see that those boards tend to be made up, at least in part, with representatives of different corporations, for instance, that support the institution, and the corporation is supporting that as well. Vince, do you have anything?
You're right. I think for most practical, right, we're probably not talking about joining Harvard's board or the Met board, where, as Claire said, those are serious commitments and expectations, and it's the role of the board is pure governance. I think what we're really trying to give counsel here on is the boards where you're going to be somewhere in the middle of that governance spectrum that Claire talked about. And I think what's most important is that you understand the expectations, whatever they are, right? We probably have people on the call today that have a pretty wide dispersion of their capacity to be philanthropic, if you will, from a financial perspective. You know what that is. That's a personal decision. And the important thing is to not be surprised, right? To not misunderstand what the expectation is as you go down the process. And a good board will make that clear. It won't be vague. And it's part of doing your homework.
Mm-hmm. Great. I think we have time for one more quick question. Could you address the issue of the role of the board governance versus the CEO management operations, which can be contentious in more mature organizations?
Yeah, it's interesting that question came up. We host a number of different panel discussions around the country geared towards an audience of not-for-profit leaders, whether it is the board chairs, CEOs, CFOs, and our next in June, we're actually going to be hosting. The topic will be on important conversations or challenging conversations, and it is going to be all about the board chair and the CEO. So one of the basic responsibilities of the board of directors, and by the way, a number of organizations could desperately use folks with human resources background and experience, but one of the roles is managing or overseeing the CEO, and so. You should have, and this is a great place where BoardSource has a lot of information actually, but and others do too, but there should be a goal set, right? There should be a business plan every year for that CEO. There should be, performance reviews, whether it's on a quarterly or a biannual, sort of basis, and then a year-end review. The board's responsibility really is to hold the CEO accountable, because the CEO, that's it. Like, they don't have really other peers at their level. It can be a somewhat lonely job, and they need that guidance, and they need to feel like someone's supporting them, and someone is pushing them, right, to do better. And so some of these conversations can be difficult. I certainly went through this on one board that I was on years ago. And I was on the executive committee. I think I was the treasurer of the organization, and the name of the game just became documenting, right? Documenting the conversations. And again, just like doing your due diligence and going into a situation feeling like you are educated about what the situation is, creating clear goals and expectations and agreeing on that with the CEO from the beginning is really critical, right? But also being flexible, right? You can't necessarily, some things just can't be set in stone. So it is a major part of the responsibility, primarily of the board chair and really that executive committee. So it's sort of the chair, the vice chair, the secretary, and the treasurer tend to be the sort of executive committee. Most of the time, if you have clear expectations from the beginning, just like any supervisory relationship, you're a step ahead.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Vince and Claire, for everything they shared with us today. It was definitely a lot of great information, and I'm sure people will continue to reach out to you again. Your information is on the screen. So thank you for your time and for sharing, all your expertise with us this morning.
Thank you so much.
We appreciate the opportunity, and we're both available if there are specific questions. But great spending time with all of you.